Welcome, and thank you for joining our monthly Your Child, Your Choice topic webinar. This month's topic focuses on secondary transition. We're pleased to be joined by Michael Stoehr, the lead education consultant for secondary transition at PaTTAN. PaTTAN offers many free and low-cost conferences, trainings, and webinars, and I'd recommend to everyone that you watch their website, PaTTAN.net, for information on the Secondary Transition Conference held each year in July in State College. This webinar is offered by the Peel Center Your Child, Your Choice program, which is funded by the Pennsylvania Developmental Disability Council. This program focuses on non-traditional school settings. Each month we offer at least one training webinar as well as companion documents featuring topic readings, leadership videos, and inspiration for families and educators. If you're interested in joining our program, please contact me at cpaternoster@peelcenter.org to register, or you can visit the Peel Center webpage and look for the Your Child, Your Choice program. Some housekeeping to take care of before we get started. This webinar is being recorded for those who are unable to listen live, and we'll be sure to send the link and PowerPoint to everyone who's on the line as well. At the end of the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. Please take a moment to do so. The feedback we receive is valuable for planning future webinars, as well as recording purposes for our funders. I have muted all the microphones to prevent echoing. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat bar on the side of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can during our scheduled call time. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Michael so that he can get us started. Good morning and welcome, Michael.
Welcome, everyone. I want to first take folks to the page where our materials can be found for today's session. And we've put together a wiki that goes along with today's PowerPoint. And the wiki is basically set up into multiple parts. Included in the wiki is the PowerPoint that I'll be using for today's session. There's a section that is really designed for educators or agency staff, but I think it's helpful for parents to review that. There's some good information on engagement, as well as there's the healthcare checklist that's included in this section also. The remaining sections of the wiki, there's information for families and caregivers, and then there is a section on transition surveys, some information on employment readiness surveys, a parent guide to the IEP, and self-determination resources. So again, a lot of really useful information can be found on that wiki site. The other resource that I wanted to draw your attention to, and we're going to be talking a little about this throughout today's session. We have, through the Pennsylvania Community of Practice on Secondary Transition and through the PaTTAN system, put together this website. It's called secondarytransition.org is the address for that site. You just type in the browser www.secondarytransition.org, and you'll find just a wealth of information around secondary transition on this particular site. It's divided up into sections based on categories, and when you click on a particular area, a particular category area, what will come up, hang on one second, is information regarding that topic. So I clicked on employment, and what will come up under employment are employment resources. So for example, you can go in and it will give you additional information about the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, links to how to apply. The other piece that's included in this section are skills that are necessary for foundational development in a particular area like employment. And those are broken into age bands. So if you look at that, you can see the skills and strategies that would be useful for a young person that's between 10 and 12 years of age to working towards employment. And they go all the way up as you scroll through, all the way up through 18 to 21-year-olds. And then we have just, again, a wealth of information on this site, in this particular case, specific to employment areas. So, again, the site is secondarytransition.org. I am going to be referencing that site also throughout the day's session. So what is secondary transition? And when we talk about that, what do we mean? And really what we're talking about is a way for students, young folks, to make that connection from what they are doing in middle school and high school to what they're going to be doing in adult life, regarding what type of employment they want to be engaged in, what type of education they will need, and how they can best live independently. Secondary transition greatly relies on partnerships, and that's partnerships between the young person, their family, the individuals involved in the education process in the school setting, so general education staff and teachers, special education staff and teachers, as well as all the ancillary supports. And then it also involves outside agency involvement. So, for example, representatives from the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in our state, or the VR system, representatives from the Office of Intellectual Disabilities or the Office of Mental Health Services. Those are all agency partners that could contribute to help supporting that young person as they make that transition from high school to adult life. Secondary transition builds on the strengths and interests of the young person and really looks at what needs they have to reach those post-secondary goals and to support those needs. Next, I want to move into just a little bit about what the purpose of transition planning is and what the law says. And this slide's really looking at what we try to do through the Department of Education for all students. The purpose for all young folks involved in the education system in our state is to prepare them to be successful once they leave school, to be both post-education ready and career ready. College and career ready is usually the term that we hear, but it's really more than just college. We really look at all those variety of post-secondary training options as well as the varying types of careers. And that's something that we really are striving for all students, whether they're in general education or special education. Now, when we talk about special education transition services, they really are designed and required specifically for those students that do have an IEP that receive special education services in a middle school or high school. However, there are a number of districts across the state that look at this process for all students, again, whether they're in special education or not. When we look at the legal requirement, though, and why students that do have an IEP that do receive special education services have to have transition, it refers back to the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA 2004. And in that legal document, the document that supports special education services for all students in our country, it states, and this is actually in the opening paragraph of that law, that the primary reason that youth and young adults are involved in special education services is for them to develop their further education, employment, and independent living skills. And when we look into this a little bit more closely, secondary transition is a coordinated set of activities, meaning that all the classes and the activities that young person is involved with is leading towards those outcomes. What type of employment that young person will have someday, what training they need to be successful, and how they want to live in the community. And this process is helping to facilitate that movement. And again, this is taken directly out of, if you look at the citation, from the legal requirement from IDEA 2004. When we look at who in Pennsylvania is required to have transition services, in Pennsylvania, transition services must be addressed in the IEP year in which the student turns 14 years of age. However, the IEP team does not have to wait until the student is approaching 14 years of age or older. The IEP team could decide to do that earlier. And as I mentioned before, transition services are only required specifically for those students that are in special education. So if a student has, for example, a 504 plan, or a student is only in general education, there is not a requirement for transition. Only those students that have IEPs. But if a student does have an IEP, transition services do have to occur in that year in which that student is turning 14 years of age. When we look at supports for students in this transition process, there needs to be, and again, this is directly written into Chapter 14, which is the Pennsylvania law, there needs to be a transition coordinator assigned to each district that helps that young person and their family and the education staff in this process. We do have a directory that we have put together, and I'm going to show you that now. And you can find this directory on the secondarytransition.org website. And the reason I'm mentioning this directory is it provides a wealth of information. There's information in here, and I'm just going to scroll down, regarding the staff through our PaTTAN system, through the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, that can provide support. So you'll notice at the state level, myself, Paula Schmidt, and our managing director out of our office, James Palmero. And then we have listed additional consultants that can assist in the transition process. Then we also have listed through the intermediate units, there are also assigned consultants for each intermediate unit regionally that help with transition, and those individuals are listed. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll down past the state leadership team because I want to get back to the transition coordinators. We have listed out in each of these sections by IU and then by school district that point person for each of the school districts. So these would be the primary contact to start to address transition services. So we have those listed by school districts and they're grouped by intermediate units for all of the school districts in the state. When you go through to the end of that, then the next thing that's listed in this directory, and let me get back to the very back of the directory, we have the charter schools listed. And listed with the charter schools, again, are those individuals that are the point persons for secondary transition, and these would be the contacts. And you'll notice we have contacts, names, either phone numbers or email addresses. So that directory is really useful. I'd recommend, if you're not sure who in your particular school setting is that primary person for transition, to look for that document. It's really essential that families are engaged in part of this transition process. When I talk with and have interacted with family members, they really are the most helpful individuals in providing the individuals that are working with a youth and young adult in this transition process. Family members, you all know your son or daughters best. You know their history, you know what has worked and what has not worked for them. You have that background experience, and you really can help support your sons and daughters in this process of secondary transition. So I want to talk about just some of the process for secondary transition. And one of the concepts is really to look or work backwards. So it's to think about, what are those desired goals for that young person? Where do they want to live someday? What type of job do they want to have? And then really going back and seeing, okay, what are those expectations and what can we do now? Whether the young person is in elementary school, middle school, or high school, to help prepare them to be as independent as possible and to achieve the outcomes that they are desiring. One of the things that continually comes up, and when I work with high school age students and even students that are juniors and seniors in high school, is really having a good understanding of themselves and their disability, as well as their strengths and their needs. And along with this, is really their idea of being as independent as possible and being able to take risks, to try things out, and not be so heavily reliant on the adults in their lives. And I know oftentimes this is really difficult because we really want to support and help the young folks out as much as possible. Your sons and daughters, as a former teacher, I really, try to do everything possible, but sometimes we do not allow for that independence to occur. We don't allow the individual to take risks, to experience, to fail, and learn from those mistakes. And that's really another important part of transition, is that the young person experiences sometimes those failures and learns from those mistakes in a controlled situation. It's important that we really strive to allow the young person to become as independent as possible. One of the examples quickly that I had a young man, and he was in 11th grade, and his mom was still putting his contact lenses in for him, and he had no physical limitations. There were no reason he couldn't have done it himself. Those types of things really should not be occurring as young people are in high school. We really should be having them become as independent as possible, doing things at home, doing, cooking skills and their own personal skills are important steps as we're preparing them to be successful once they leave high school, once they get out on their own. When we look at self-determination and kind of that idea of having a young person being self-determined, what it really means is being able to accept and respect oneself. It's also important that young person is able to set goals and understand what those goals are. And we'll talk a little more about this when we discuss the IEP, and we're looking at both the transition post-secondary goals of further training, employment, and independent living, as well as the measurable annual goals. That the young person really should be invested in those, have a good understanding about what they're working on in school, both the measurable annual IEP goals that are based on the skills they need to work on, as well as their post-secondary goals. I really like this particular slide, and it was something that was put together from the National Dissemination Center for Children with Disabilities, or NICHE. And it looks at what are the fundamental skills for adult success, or in other words, what things should individuals with disabilities be working on as they are transitioning from high school to adult life. And when we look at this slide, again, you'll see some ongoing themes. An awareness of self, of their strengths and what they're able to do really well, but then also their needs. And then along with the awareness of their needs, what supports do they use that really make sense? What are those accommodations or that assistive technology that really helps that individual to be independent? Also, knowledge of rights. And what we're talking about here are rights that that young person has once they reach adulthood. When we look at young folks in transition, while they are in school, while they are still connected to the education system, they are entitled to services and supports. However, once they graduate, that young person then goes into an eligibility standard for services and supports. So if they're going on to higher ed or they're going to be in an employment situation, they need to become eligible for those services, and they really need to know what are reasonable accommodations that they need based on their specific disability. The other piece of these fundamental skills for adult success is the idea of self-advocacy, and that young person really being able to understand themselves and then also understand how to best advocate for supports and services they need, whether that is in a post-secondary educational setting, in an employment setting, or in the community. The next thing we want to talk about and move into is talking about what the process for secondary transition looks like in the educational system in our state, in Pennsylvania. And these next set of slides are literally looking at the training process that we have done through the PaTTAN system and the IAU system with all of the school districts, charter schools, approved private schools, as well as career tech ed centers across the state. And what we're looking at here is this structure. And the structure that we're talking about is first that secondary transition involves an individualized process. We're really looking at honing in through assessment on what that young person is interested in doing once they leave school, looking at those post-secondary goals for employment, what kind of training they will need to support that employment, and then looking at how they're going to live independently. Then we also look at partnerships, and we mentioned earlier in a slide about the various partnerships. So we're talking family partnerships, we're talking about the partnerships within the education system, as well as those partnerships with agencies and community members. Then another key part of secondary transition is engaging that young person. And again, with those earlier slides we're showing is that we're really striving for that young person to have a good understanding of themselves, their disability, and what supports and accommodations they need. And then lastly, as you're looking at this graphic, it's reviewing what needs to be in place within the school system for this to occur. And what we're talking about here is the classes, the activities that are in an educational setting that allow for supports of this young person in being successful once they leave school. So we're going to talk first about this individualized process. And the individualized process, again, it's based on that young person. It's based on assessment and looking at what that young person would like to do once they leave school. It's grounded in the general education curriculum because we're really looking at those standards and really striving to have all students reach their greatest potential before they graduate. This individualized process also builds on increasing their academic skills, their social and interpersonal skills, their ability and work skills, as well as their self-advocacy skills. This next graphic is really looking at the process. So as a student at age 14 enters into the secondary transition process, this is what should be occurring as part of their educational programming. This is also kind of the behind the scenes of what happens when we look at the development of their IEP. So what we're going to be doing in the next series of slides is going through all the steps that are on this roadmap for secondary transition. So the first step is looking at assessment. And when we're talking about assessment here, we're talking about the assessment of interest, preference, and aptitudes. So this is really the part where we're trying to figure out from that young person what they are interested in doing. And again, what type of job would they want to have someday, and then kind of looking at what that job would be and then figuring out what type of training would be needed, and then how that young person sees themselves living in the community once they would graduate and how they would participate in their communities. So to obtain this information, there's a variety of different ways that can be done. Oftentimes, it's through interviews and surveys of both the young person, their family members, and other individuals that are in contact with that young person. So maybe the young person volunteers in their community and in talking with the folks that work at that volunteer site. That could provide good information. However, it's important that it is not just interviews and surveys that the young person and their family are completing. We really also need to have more formalized assessment because oftentimes what will happen is the young person in an interview or taking a survey will basically only state what they know. So for example, oftentimes kids in middle school, they'll look at the people they see around them, especially the famous people. So, in our Pittsburgh area, they might look at wanting to be Sidney Crosby on the Pittsburgh Penguins or Ben Roethlisberger, or, they might want to, look at the radio or, the music industry and they want to be Rihanna or Jay-Z or Justin Timberlake because that's kind of the reality. Or they might look at what their family does, what their mom or their dad does or their favorite uncle, and hey, that's what I want to do for a living. But they don't really know what is the wealth of different career options that are out there. And what the formal assessments would do is they help that young person look at, okay, what are the things that I like? What are the things that I'm good at? And then coming up with, okay, these are jobs that really take those attributes that you have and those interests, and they develop those. So, for example, a young person might turn out to be, really good in some type of creative arts area, and then it would show what different types of career options are available for that individual. This slide is showing just some examples of assessments that are available looking at interests and preferences, and these are more formalized. And the first two that are listed on there are actually free online sites. PaCareerZone.org has 4 different assessments that are listed you'll want to look at. And then the second bullet is alifeforme.org, and that's actually a site that is from the state of Virginia. And there are really very nice resources on not only looking at interest and preference development, but also in looking at developing a good self-understanding, self-advocacy skills. It may be important as a family member to talk to your school district about what assessments they are using regarding interests and preferences. And you should be able to find those listed as you look at your son or daughter's IEP and look at, where did they come up with the post-secondary goals for that young person from. They should be based on assessment. And it may be some of these. There are many others that they could use as formalized assessments in addition to interviewing the young person, interviewing you as a family member. The next piece that we want to look at in this process is the development of the post-secondary goals. So you have the assessment piece, and basically that assessment, so the interviews, the surveys, as well as the more formalized assessment, where it's going to give you outcomes. And basically what the outcomes are, again, are looking at where does the young person want to live, what type of job do they want to have someday, and then what kind of training would be needed in order to obtain that job or that type of employment. It's interesting, on the one assessment that we talked about, the PA Career Zone, there is an assessment called Budgeting for Life. And that particular assessment is really nice because it does a lot of background questions with a young person about what type of car do you want to have, where do you want to live, what type of housing options do you want to have, do you want to rent, do you want to own. And after getting done with answering all those questions, what comes out is a amount of money that would be needed each month in order to live that lifestyle. And then the assessment takes it a step further, and it allows the young person to look at what types of jobs would provide that amount of income, and then what training would be needed in order to have that type of job. So it's kind of an interesting way of helping some students that are really struggling, or those students that really don't see a point of planning for the future, and helping them to plan. So in this next piece, what we're going to look at a little bit are the post-secondary goals and how those need to be written and developed, and we have some examples of how those could be written. But again, know that these need to be based on assessment, both interviews, surveys from the young person, your sons or daughters, as well as input from you as family members, any other individuals who would have relevant information to add to that. That's really where these particular post-secondary goals should be coming from. So these next couple slides, what I'm going to do is just kind of break down some examples of these areas. So we're looking at here are example statements for employment. And we have here, they're mainly different types of jobs that you'll see. So like, for example, working in the travel industry, or a goal of supported employment in the food service area. We also look at students being involved in the armed forces as employment types of areas. Statements as far as post-secondary education, these would be things like different types of programs, be they going to college or technical schools or employment training or on-the-job training. And then lastly, we're looking at independent living, and these are statements that would be in that section or those considerations for independent living. So things that, such as want to live on their own independently or with supports from their family or supports from an agency or a resource. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the fact that all three of these areas, further training, employment, and independent living, need to be addressed for all students. However, in some cases, like in the example here, if the young person is very independent, the school really wouldn't feel a need to work on independent living skills. You know, for example, the young person drives, the young person is able to take care of all their daily needs, possibly works part-time, is really independent, then there really wouldn't be a purpose to have a goal that they would be working on. However, for most students, and most students that have IEPs, all three areas are addressed, and you have the other sections that go along with these post-secondary goals, the courses of study, and the activities and services. Okay, the next piece that we're going to move on to, so we've talked now about looking at what the young person is interested in doing, and that's based on assessment, and we address that for the training, employment, and independent living. And now we're going to move into this next piece of assessment, which is looking at the aptitudes and abilities that the young person has. So when we look at this particular section, this is the assessment piece that I think folks are probably most familiar with. So these are the assessments that are done in schools. Some of them are the formalized once-a-year assessments like the PSSA and now the Keystone exams that are coming in our state. But these could also be assessments that are done in the classroom. So something that has been used in our state more recently is the comprehensive diagnostic tools, or CDTs, that schools will be using for assessment. But these are also assessments such as teacher-made assessments that are done to evaluate how well that student is doing in the various academic courses that they are taking. When we look at this idea of what the young person wants to do based on assessment and then where they are currently functioning, we call that idea a gap analysis. And I'm going to go back just for a minute to that map again. So what we're talking about here is through assessment, let's say that the young person is really interested in being a nurse. And that's what the employment goal is. And we talked to the young person about the fact that in order to do that, you would need to go on to a 4-year college to be a registered nurse. So that's their goal, and they want to live independently. Then we go over and we're looking at, all right, so then what are the requirements in order to be a nurse? Well, in order to go to college, you're going to be able to read, access information at the 12th grade level. Your science and math skills need to be at that level. And really looking at what are the requirements and the physical requirements in order to be a nurse. And the gap analysis comes in as we look at where is the student currently functioning. So say, for example, the young person is reading, doing math, doing science at around the 5th grade level, and they're in 11th grade. So there is a gap there, or there needs to be something or a bridge in order for that young person to fulfill that desire to go into nursing. Now, sometimes that can be done with accommodations, supports, assistive technology, and sometimes if that gap is really large, then it may be looking at, with that young person, what are some of the attributes of that job that you would really be interested in. So maybe you may not be able to go to a 4-year college to become a nurse, but what are other areas of that medical field that you might be interested in doing? And on this slide, back to this slide, what it's talking about is really looking at some of those questions. So for example, you know, the young person, Chad, wants to go into an auto tech program. What are his current comprehension, reading comprehension skills and writing skills like? And how can he be successful in that program? Or, for example, you know, looking at Mike and his current work habits. Is he ready for, or does he have the skills to go into competitive employment? And I think the important thing with gap analysis and talking about this, it's not saying that an individual cannot do a particular post-secondary goal, but it's really looking at what needs to be in place in order for them to be successful. And part of this comes in with really having a good understanding of what are the requirements for that type of employment, as well as the training leading to that employment. And there are a number of really good sites that help young folks and those working to support them, so the education agency staff members as well as families, to find out what are requirements. There's a site that the Department of Labor has called ONET. It's O with the star, net, N-E-T, and you can Google that, and that site will go in and it will tell you what are the various different jobs that are out there and what skills are needed, both academic as well as functional skills, in order to be successful in that particular career area. There is also an organization called the Job Accommodations Network, or JAN. And again, if you Google JAN, it'll take you to their site. And what the Job Accommodations Network does is it provides information on what accommodations can be given in various types of employment settings based on a variety of different types of disabilities. So those types of supports help the young person, the family members, and those working with them to really examine what are requirements of post-secondary employment as well as training, and what supports could be given to help that young person to be successful in those areas. It's important to note that with both the interest and preference assessments as well as the academic and functional assessment, that last bullet there, it's really important that that data is interpreted and that it is utilized. So what that really means is that we're not just having scores listed there, that that information is discussed, and you can see why, for example, they're working on certain skills with your son or daughter in school for that particular year in that IEP. It also should be clearly indicated, you know, these are the things that the young person wants to do once they leave school, and this is the assessment to back that up. I should mention also that what the young person wants to do probably 95% of the time changes from when they start this process when they were 14 until they graduate when they're seniors in high school. It changes many times, but that's really the essence of secondary transition. It's to allow the young person to explore and experience different types of jobs, different types of training options, to have an idea of what the requirements are, so that when they do graduate, they are better prepared and are successful, and they're not staying at home and sitting on the couch, that there is this connection to what happens after they graduate from high school. Okay, the next step that we want to move into is talking about, you know, what do we do now that we have this assessment information? All right, so we have interest and preference information, we have academic and functional information, and what do we do with that? So when we talk about students in special education and we're looking at the IEP, this is where this information is placed. It's in the present ed levels. So it's really the first major section of the IEP document. And when we look at the present ed level section, the thing on this slide I'd really like you to hone in on is the bullet that's in bold, and it says that the information that's listed there should be relevant, useful, and understandable. And it should be relevant, useful, and understandable to the young person, your son or daughter, as well as to you as a family member, as well as the education and the agency folks. The other thing is that all of the items that are being worked on, those measurable annual goals, should have a starting point or baseline data included in that present ed level section that support why that is being worked on. It's also important to note that each bullet of the IEP is being addressed. So what we're really looking at there is that each section has information contained within it, that none of those sections that are listed there are left blank. And this slide I like also because I think it's a clean way of looking at that present ed level section of the IEP, including the section on post-secondary education, post-secondary transition section. When we look at the academic skills section, the functional skills section, and then that post-secondary transition section, as well as parent input and how the disability, in fact, impacts the general education curriculum, think about all of that information as data or facts that are going into a funnel. And what comes out of the funnel is listing that young person's strengths and their needs. So there should not be any strengths or needs listed in that document that you cannot go back up and find a reference to either in academic skills, functional skills, or in the transition section. There should be information that ties in. And if there's not a kind of a disconnect, and as an IEP member, IEP team member, it really would be a question to ask, like, if there is a need, where did that information come from and why are you working on that? Likewise, for the post-secondary transition section, why are you documenting that the young person has this as a career goal, or this is where they want to go as far as post-secondary education or training? So the bottom line is there needs to be data to support this, which is why we spent some time on that section on assessment. In this slide, what we're looking at is an example of a young man named Philip. And Philip is in 11th grade. He has a diagnosis of a learning disability. And what we're looking at here with this writing example is that when we are in present ed levels and we're in the academic section, what it's saying is that Philip has difficulty with spelling, capitalization, grammar, and punctuation. And it's on short writing assignments. And Philip wants to go into auto body. He wants to be an auto body tech person. And in that job, he would have to do and write up estimates. And he really struggles with that. And we really want Philip to be successful. So he has a need to really work on proofreading. In the transition section, we're aligning this to say that, well, we are going to be working on writing and editing skills, and that's in the transition section. Then he has a goal that we're actually going to teach him a strategy called SCOPE that's going to help him with checking his spelling and making sure that what he's writing is done correctly. And then we are bi-weekly going to check his progress and let Philip know, as well as let his family know that this is the progress that he is making. So this is also really important, the fact that there does need to be alignment between what the student wants to do once they leave school, what their needs are, and then what they're working on as part of their educational program. In the next section we want to talk about when we're talking about secondary transition is really looking at this idea of engaging partners. And remember, when we looked at that slide, one of the key parts of that, along with this individualized process, was the engagement of partners, both family partners as well as outside partners, agency and the community. When we look at who has to be part of an IEP team, you'll see on this slide, it has listed the parents and the local education agency or the school district, general education teacher, special education teacher. In red, you'll note that the student also has to be involved or at least invited to the IEP meeting starting at age 14 when they are turning transition age. We also talk about how important it is really that the student isn't just invited, but they are actively involved in that meeting to really start to take ownership and to be involved in this process. It's important that they have an understanding of what they're working on, have a good idea about what they want to do once they leave school, and really have this being driven by that young person. Other members that could be included are listed on the right-hand side, but note that in red we have mentioned community agencies and representatives. And the reason for that is it's the responsibility of the education system to make sure that the young person and their family are aware of those agencies that can support the young person as they are transitioning into adulthood. This slide just shows briefly some of the many outside agencies that could be involved in this process. And for some families, there could be quite a number of these. For others, there just may be one or two of these agencies that would be involved in this process. You'll notice also on here that we've included some of the education entities too. So for example, if the young person is involved in career and tech education training at a career and tech ed center, that is part of the education system, but a representative from that particular school would also need to be part of this IEP team. Excuse me. On this slide, what we're looking at with agency involvement in transition, it's just a description of, again, that fact that school districts need to, and charter schools, school entities, need to make sure that agencies are invited, engaged, and that the young person and their family are aware of which agencies can provide for supports. For students that are just entering transition, so those students that are in middle school, say 7th and 8th grade, up through possibly 11th grade, they may be limited as far as which agencies could be invited. However, if a student does have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability, engagement of the Office of Intellectual Disabilities is really something that should be considered early on because they can take part in those services. Likewise, if the student has mental health issues or is involved in foster care or has a specific disability where there are related supports out there, for example, if the student has a seizure disability, the Epilepsy Foundation is really a good resource to connect to. Or if the student has a diagnosis of being on the autism spectrum, looking at services offered through the autism system. Some agencies, however, may not be involved with that young person until they're in their junior or senior year. An example of that might be the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, or OVR. But regardless, the family and the young person should be informed of what supports are available as part of the transition process. And it shouldn't be a surprise or waiting until that last year in school, that senior year, to find out what agency supports are around or available. I wanted to take a minute and just let folks know we have a couple of resources that are available, and I'm going to show you these now. Again, referring back to the secondary transition.org site, and on this part, it's state agency contact, and this is found under the tab on the home page, agencies. You'll notice that we have listed the state, at the state level, agencies and their contacts, along with links on additional information. So you'll see there, for example, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, Office of Children, Family, and Youth, developmental programs if the individual has intellectual disabilities, and so forth. The other thing that we have listed on the secondarytransition.org site are Pennsylvania resources by county. And this is also a really nice place to go if you want to find out what resources are in your specific county area. So, for example, if we click on Allegheny County, it takes us to in Allegheny County something called the Family Resource Guide. And this is an excellent resource. Probably the folks in Allegheny County, you're most fortunate because there's a very well-developed site here. So for example, if I'm looking at what supports might be available for the young person that I'm working with, for my son or daughter, I could click on this and say I'm looking at vocational supports or job training. It has listed here a wealth of different organizations that provide supports for vocational supports and job training. And then each of these link then to these individual websites. If you are not in Allegheny County, when you click on or go to the other counties, some of them have directories that are more like in a PDF form. So that's what you would see there. But the reason that I wanted to take just a minute to point this out is those are listed again on the secondarytransition.org website, and it's a nice way to know what resources are possibly available to assist your son or daughter or the young person that you are working with and helping them in this transition process. Okay, we're going to move now back to looking at this process for transition. So we've talked about assessment and the importance of figuring out what the young person wants to do and figuring out those outcomes of further training, employment, and independent living. We next looked at where that young person was functioning as far as their academic skills, functional skills, and then we talked a little bit about kind of that gap analysis and how we can really help work with the young person to reach those goals or look at possibly altering those goals so they can be successful once they leave school. Then we looked at how that information is documented. Then we're now moving into looking at that section of the IEP that is specific to transition. And this section, it's section 3 of the IEP. We often call it the transition grid because it looks like a grid, right? So just looking at this slide, and if you can take your attention and look at the grid itself, we already talked about these post-secondary goals. So you'll see it has employment here, okay? Now what we're going to get into next is to talk about what this box over here means as far as measurable annual goal, yes or no. And then we're going to talk about the courses of study and then what needs to be discussed as far as services and activities. While we're on this slide, I am going to talk a little bit about the box that's here. And what this is talking about is if the student has a goal, a post-secondary goal for post-secondary training, employment, or independent living, then, as we look over here, that student has to be working on measurable goals that are helping them reach that outcome. So, for example, the example that we had with Philip, who was interested in going into auto body, he needed to work on his proofreading skills. So he has his goal as he wants to be competitively employed in the area of auto body repair, and one of his measurable annual goals then would be to work on proofreading skills, and you'd see a reference to that here in the grid. Okay, so we're going to move now, talk a little bit about courses of study. And another way of talking about courses of study is just to let you know that they're the classes. They're the classes the young person is taking in middle school and high school. It's also important to note that the transition section, just like the rest of the IEP, is a one-year document. So what you're seeing in the transition section is what is occurring during that IEP year for that student. So courses of study, they are the classes that young person is taking. They should be helping that young person move toward their goal of going on for further training, employment, and living independently. They should show and align to that district's graduation standards. They should align to a rigorous curriculum for that young person. And when you look at them, they should make sense. You should see a progress for that young person towards graduation. The next thing we want to look at, so again, thinking back to the grid, we talked about the post-secondary goals, and then under it was the courses of study. Now under that is the next section of the grid. And in this section, what we're talking about are looking at both the transition services and activities. And what these are not classes now. These are what activities and then also what measurable annual goals the young person is working on in order to be successful in reaching those post-secondary goals. This slide hopefully will help explain this a little bit better. When we're looking at this, we're talking about examples of services. So these, again, another way of thinking of a service are what are the measurable annual goals that young person is working on for that year. So these might be things such as working on writing skills or reading comprehension skills or improving math skills. And then examples of activities, these are not measurable annual goals. These are more of oftentimes just in time, like once a year type of activities, such as attending a job fair or a college fair, or they might be meeting with a guidance counselor, or it might be working on a project or doing a research paper about jobs. These are activities that are helping that young person, again, reach those post-secondary goals of further training, employment, and independent living. And in the next couple of slides, I just have a few examples of what these could be. So as we're looking here, this is a post-secondary education and training example of some things that are possible. These are some activities that could be considered under employment. And again, what these are doing is really helping that young person in reaching that goal, say, of competitive employment. So things such as working on resume writing or doing a job shadow in the community to see what different jobs are like. We had talked about earlier, I had mentioned the Job Accommodations Network, having the young person look at that particular site or to contact them about what supports are available for me as an individual with a certain type of disability. And then on this slide, we're looking at those independent living goals. Independent living post-secondary goals and the activities that align to those. I want to next just show you an example of how this may appear, this transition section. So in this example, we have this young person whose name is Shawna. Shawna is 16. She's included in general education for family, consumer science, phys ed, and horticulture. She is involved in a life skills support program for part of her day. And she's interested in exploring post-secondary training, eventually for competitive employment. And she is connected to or receives services through the Office of Intellectual Disabilities in her county. So this is an example of what her transition section looks like. So what you'll notice here is we have the post-secondary goal. It's listed. You'll notice that there's yes marked because she is working on developing a working vocabulary of sight words for her engagement in the community so she can access and get around and get to her post-secondary training program. These are the courses that she's involved with. And then these are 2 activities that she will engage with over the course of this IEP year. So she's going to explore different employment training programs that are available, and then she's also going to work on practicing her self-advocacy skills. This is an example of what the employment section would look like. And again, we have the goal. We have it marked yes, and the reason it's yes is we actually have 2 referenced measurable annual goals here, working on following directions and working on travel training. And then she is going to have a work experience that she's doing in the community through the school year. And then on this last example, we have, again, her independent living goal, her courses of study, and then yes is marked because we're referencing 2 measurable annual goals, and then an activity of investigating different types of funding that might be available for her, and that would be at in conjunction with her supports coordinator for the Office of Intellectual Disability along with the family and Shawna. Okay, so then the next piece that we're going to look at, we've talked about the assessment piece, we've talked about looking at how the present ed levels need to be written with good documentation. We've just finished talking about the transition section, which included those post-secondary goals that the young person has, the courses of studies, and those activities and services. Now we're going to just look at that final piece of this process, which is looking at the measurable goals and how they're monitored for progress. It's important in noting that measurable annual goals should cover 1 year. They should address skills deficits or identified needs that the young person has. As we mentioned, they should be based on data, information in the present ed levels, baseline, and they should be something that are obtainable over the course of one IEP year. Remember, the document is good for 1 year. These goals should be able to be obtained over the course of the year. They're not a total curriculum, so you really shouldn't see a biology goal or a music class goal. They're really dealing more with those skill areas of need, such as reading or math or maybe written expression or possibly functional skill areas, such as a behavior need. They should contain measurable, accountable data. And when we talk about these, for most individuals, really should only have about 3 to 5 goals. There may be some exceptions to that, but the reason that we talk about that is if you have too many goals, if you have 20 goals, it's really hard for that young person to achieve those over the course of a 1 year period. What measurable goals are not, as we mentioned, they're not curriculum, they're not for a subject area, and they're not simply written as, you know, the student will get A's in all his classes or pass all their classes. They really need to be based on a specific skill deficit area. And they're not just activities. You really wouldn't have a measurable goal such as visiting a college fair or doing a job shadowing activity. Because again, that's not based on a skill deficit area. And this is what I've been saying the last couple of slides. The measurable goals must be skill building. In other words, they should be designed to help that young person access and participate and make progress in the general education curriculum. The measurable annual goals and short-term objectives must build on skills. And this bullet, I think, is really important, the last bullet. And this is where we get into, you know, the idea of 3 to 5, because those goals need to focus on the biggest areas of need that are going to make the biggest difference for that student, again, in reaching their post-secondary goals. This slide's talking about what types of things could be written, especially for kids that are in middle schools and high school, regarding measurable annual goals. Of course, you have your academic skills, reading, writing, math areas, but then you also have these other domain areas that, depending on the student and their prioritization of needs, you could be writing a goal for these areas. This slide is just something that we share, and we share this with educators on what needs to be included in a measurable annual goal, looking at the condition, the student's name, the clearly defined behavior. You should be able to tell by looking at that goal what the young person is going to do, and then there should be a way that that information is going to be documented and reported. So how well, how consistently, and how often the student is going to do that to show mastery. As part of this process, it's really important that then those goals are monitored, that the progress is monitored, and that that's reported to the young person and to the family. And that that is something that is documented so that you can see and the young person can see the progress that they are making. So again, we talked about this example and really just wanted to hone in on this last part of this slide where we saw the need. It was referenced in the grid, the transition section. We have this goal for Philip, and then note the progress monitoring piece, the fact that it is reported every other week. This is the example of the goal for Philip. So it's basically because he is having difficulty with proofreading, we're going to try to teach him this strategy called SCOPE, which stands for spelling, capitalization, looking at omissions, punctuation, and then when he's reading it aloud, does it make sense? Then this is a slide that's just briefly showing the progress that he would be making in using this strategy. And then the next slide is showing his progress in progress reports that were sent home. And you may, or the young person may request to have more information. So he is being monitored every other week. Then you may want to see, say, reports once a month and not wait for that 9-week grading period. Or the young person may want that to see, hey, how am I doing? So that was the process that we have in Pennsylvania, especially looking at the tie-in with the IEP. And I think what this slide is saying really that you as a family member supporting your sons and daughters really have an important role to help that young person in looking at their life skills and really looking at giving them the experiences to work, to live independently, to go on to further training. When I was showing, again, the secondary transition.org website, looking at those different skill areas that are listed under employment, under post-secondary education and training, under community engagement and self-advocacy. Really looking at working on those skills early. If you notice, those started at 10 to 11 years of age, all the way through till that young person is 18 to 21. What could be done to help support them? We talked about some of these areas on this slide at the very beginning of today's session, but it's important that we really help the young person become independent, that we allow them to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes, and really work on their understanding of what they do well and what they need to work on. And then I think with the needs, to really understand what supports are available, what are the accommodations I can utilize, or what is the assistive technology that's available that could allow me to be successful. Now, on this slide, what we're showing are some additional resources that are available. And these are in addition to some of the information that was on the wiki. And I noticed a couple people have joined us a little late, so I just wanted to remind folks that we do have, and I'll pull it over, for this particular presentation, I put together this wiki. And basically what is on here is the PowerPoint that we've been viewing as we went through today. And then there's information both for agency and educators, but then the bulk of this page is really for families, caregivers to review. And there's information here, just general information about facts about secondary transition, this IEP process and what should be included. And then when we were talking about assessment, to go back and reiterate, there's information here on that can be obtained from families as far as family surveys. There's a transition survey that the young person and the family member could complete. There is information about employment readiness skills to really look at what skills are required and what could be utilized to help a young person in developing work skills. And then there are also self-determination resources and some resources on this page is actually a listing of additional websites and resources on for families to assist their sons and daughters in this process. So again, that's on this assessment wiki that we talked about at the beginning of today's session. Also wanted to mention we spent a lot of time today talking about how important it is for young folks to become more independent and to be able to advocate for themselves and understand how to be successful on their own. So this particular document, it's called Relish is More Than Hot Dogs, Helping Students Make Their Own Sweet Success. It's really a nice guide that goes in depth about helping a family along with the young person to look at developing self-determination skills and how to practice those skills. And it also lists a number of resources that are available to help in this particular process of developing self-determination skills. We mentioned the secondarytransition.org website, and again, I'd like to reiterate the fact that that's a wonderful resource. I would really highly recommend going there and viewing that. And with that, we are going to break, and I don't know if there are any questions, but I'll open this up. If there are, we have a few minutes if there are any specific questions.
Hi, Michael. I do have some questions that were submitted in advance, and I've collected a few. I just do really want to mention, though, I think that that wiki that you put together really answers an awful lot of the questions that had been submitted to me. One of the questions was recommendations for resources to teach self-advocacy, and I noticed as you were going through the wiki that there's a few really good resources there. So I think that that would take care of those resources for that question. A parent had asked that there's no resources listed in their area. You had shown resources by county, and the question was, if there's no resources listed for their area, what would you recommend?
Yeah, we're in the process of gathering those for all the counties across the state. If there's none in your particular area, I would go back to that directory that I mentioned that was on the secondarytransition.org site where we've listed out the intermediate units, and I'd contact the intermediate unit transition consultant that listed there, because they would know what would be available in your particular county. That would probably be your best bet.
Okay, that's really helpful. Another question was, the process that you're talking about here, does that apply to charters and cyber charters the same way as it does traditional brick and mortar schools?
Yes, it does. They're under the same regulations federally and through the state. And actually the training that we offer through the PaTTAN system and the IU system does include the charter schools as part of that process. Now, we don't train all of the schools, the school districts, charter schools, cyber charter schools in 1 year, but we have in the past 7 years, we did do an initial training with everyone, and we're starting that process again. So the requirement is in place. So what we had talked about, if you attend a school district, a charter school, or cyber charter school, everything we talked about should be occurring as part of your child's programming. And again, it's something that you as an IEP team member could bring up and discuss, because it should be occurring.
And I'd also like to point out, Michael, that I think that that wiki that you created, as well as today's PowerPoint, would be particularly helpful for a family if they were in a private or religious school where there may not be these same legal requirements. Like you said in the beginning, there's no requirement for 504 plans to have transition services, but I think you've laid things out very nicely so families can follow some of these processes on their own.
Yeah, and I'd also, the secondarytransition.org website too, while we are talking about kids that have IEPs in special education, really anybody, I mean, even a young person with, in general education, these are really just good concepts to help prepare one for the future.
Right, I agree. I'm going to ask you in a minute to talk about the transition conference in the summer, but I'd like to do a plug. Next week, March 13th at noon, we're going to do a webinar called There Are No IEPs in College. and we have Keith from Penn State who's going to be doing that with us. And we also have 2 featured speakers at our transition conference April 9th here in Cranberry Township. Michael Callahan will talk about the discovery method, and Jeff Struley will talk about life after high school and having a rich and engaging life. So those are 2 things that we have coming up in the next few months. But Michael, do you mind giving us a preview a little bit of the
I would love
conference?
to do that. And I pulled up the save the date for our transition conference. It is July 16th through the 18th at the Penn Stater Conference Center and Hotel in State College. And a couple of things about this conference. It is 2.5 days. And you'll see, as we have up on the screen, it really does deal with a lot of the issues that we talked about during today's webinar. I also wanted to point out that we do offer scholarships for family members to attend. The scholarships cover the registration fee and the hotel costs. And more information will be available regarding the actual brochure as well as the scholarship by, the middle of May. So check back again at secondarytransition.org or the PaTTAN website for that information. We also offer for youth, young adults that are 16 to 21 scholarships to attend a specialized youth track that is designed specifically for young adults, young adults, and it is run and supported by the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network. And the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network, or PYLN, is made up of young adults who have a variety of different types of disabilities, who have been involved in this transition process, and really their goal is to help young folks that are currently in high school to make that transition. So again, I really would recommend going. Parents have really gotten a lot out of this particular conference. It's a nice way to network. It's a nice way to find out what resources are available. And you can find this date saver on both the PaTTAN website as well as the secondarytransition.org website.
And I can tell you from personal experience, I've been to the conference a few times. I brought my son a few times, and he really does have a good time. In the beginning, he didn't want to go because he was complaining he'd have to sit in classes. But his teachers do talk about how good he is at self-advocating, and I think a lot of it is because he hears these things from people besides mom. You know how that works. You had mentioned a youth track and a scholarship. Where would we find that information?
Again, it'll be posted on secondarytransition.org as well as the PaTTAN website, but look for it after mid-May.
Excellent.
We're still in the process right now of finalizing the program and looking at the funding for the scholarships, but it will be available after May 15th on either of those sites.
Great. One more quick question, Michael. What happens if there's a conflict between parents and students regarding secondary transition goals? Maybe a parent thinks a child needs to bank their diploma and the student does. Any guidance? That was a question that I got from an educator.
Yeah, I think that really needs to be part of the discussion to have at the IEP meeting, or possibly to have at a transition-specific meeting with the young person and their family, and to really talk about the desires that both entities have, both the young person has and their reason for wanting to graduate, as well as the family. And almost like when we were talking about looking at the outcomes, to talk about what is it that you're doing in school, what are the requirements for what you want to do after school, and to have that discussion. Because I think oftentimes it's a lack of communication and understanding that occurs. So I think it's important that you need to have those discussions. And the other thing, too, is that hopefully that discussion should happen early on, that we're not waiting until like 11th or 12th grade to say, oh, well, I don't want to do this. Like, to have that really thought-filled discussion about why are you staying in school, for example, until you're 21, and what what's that going to do for you? I made a mistake as a transition coordinator. I can remember the one young man in particular where I really, pushed, oh, you need to stay in school, and it was really not beneficial to that young person. He did not want to be there, and it was really difficult. It was a difficult last year for him, we'll put it that way. And then I think if I could go back and redo it, I really would have done a much better job of working with him as well as the family to discuss the options, to see what could be done. I think the other thing, too, when we look at students, especially those staying until they're 18, into those 18 to 21-year programs, is it should, excuse me, it should look different than what they did in those earlier high school years. The young person shouldn't just be taking classes and staying in that high school environment. Hopefully, they are engaged in other activities that are leading them to successful employment, to further training employment. So, I think those are just some things to consider, but I really think it boils down to going back and having those discussions, looking at the assessment, looking at what the young person wants to do once they leave school, and hopefully having that discussion would help. And hopefully that answers that question.
I think that covered it. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you again for taking the time to give us this information. And thank you to everyone. As you're ending the webinar, please take a moment to give us some feedback on our presentation today and what you'd like to see in the future. And don't forget about our webinar next week. Thank you once again, Michael. I really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Michael. I'm getting really good feedback so far.
Oh, good. Very good.
I'll make sure that I give you a copy of, I'll send you a link for the recorded webinar, and I'll make sure that you hear what the feedback was.
Great. That sounds good. And, I think whenever it's posted, if you link the wiki, that will help folks because they can get the materials and stuff. That's why I kind of put everything there. It's